The following program is presented by the Far East Broadcasting Company because stories of people living out the gospel with their lives inspire all of us. FEBC, taking Christ to the world through radio and new media. Learn more at febc.org.
And we desperately need the perspective of those who have gone before us. The whole idea of the communion of saints that we almost never think about, this idea that we're actually part of a church community that transcends centuries, enrich our lives if we took it seriously.
What does the real story of Thanksgiving tell us about loving God and learning from history? Welcome to this edition of First Person as we talk with historian Dr. Tracy McKenzie about the first Thanksgiving. I'm Wayne Shepherd. I invite you to listen as we explore the lessons of the Pilgrims, even as we prepare to celebrate this meaningful holiday. These First Person interviews come to you each week as we sit down to meet some interesting people. I certainly hope you'll stay tuned, but if you miss any portion of what's to come, please visit firstpersoninterview.com to listen online or use our smartphone app. As we talk about giving thanks today, please take a moment to thank the Far East Broadcasting Company for making this program possible. Our guest now, Dr. Tracy McKenzie, is professor and chair of the Department of History at Wheaton College in Illinois. He's the author of several books, including The First Thanksgiving, which we'll discuss today. We have more information about Dr. McKenzie and his history blog at our website, firstpersoninterview.com. When we sat down recently to talk, I began by asking Tracy what led him on this quest to understand with historical accuracy the first Thanksgiving.
Wayne, I actually began exploring the possibility of this project over a decade ago. Over time, I just began to have more and more of a longing to be in conversation with other Christians about how we remember the past as believers. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to be in conversation with Christians about what it means to think Christianly when we remember the past. But I thought that doing so in the abstract wasn't very effective. I wanted some sort of concrete context
something
to do
anchor
that.
It to,
a story,
Mm-hmm.
a story that we're familiar with and can explore. And over time, it just dawned on me that I thought the Thanksgiving story was a perfect context for having that kind of conversation.
I find that fascinating, as I find the whole approach to history fascinating, and that deserves an entire conversation in and of itself. I wish we could go deeper on that and deeper even on Thanksgiving here today, but with the time that we have, let's talk about it. First of all, I know that you've written much about the Civil War, and it was interesting to me to learn that the real celebration of Thanksgiving, of course, goes back to the Pilgrims, and we'll talk about all that. But it was in the 1840s that it came really into American consciousness, if I'm correct in saying that, just prior to the Civil War. Tell that story about the Civil War and the South's reaction to Thanksgiving.
Well, when we think about Thanksgiving as a national holiday, as opposed to a holiday that's celebrated in a region of the country or in a particular state, as a national holiday, we would trace it to the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln issues a national proclamation for a day of Thanksgiving in the fall of 1863. And when he does that, that initiates an unbroken string that continues to this day. So we might remember that year as the first national observance of Thanksgiving. Except when I say national, of course, I don't mean national, because at that moment the country was rent asunder in civil war. And in fact, in the context in which Lincoln is issuing a proclamation for a day of Thanksgiving, it's clear that part of what he wants Americans to be thankful for is Union victories on the battlefield.
Okay.
And so in a way that we tend not to remember, at the time, many Southerners saw Thanksgiving as, one, a northern holiday, and secondly, a holiday that was infused with political significance.
Mm-hmm. It was part of that war of northern aggression,
absolutely.
wasn't it? Yeah.
Fair enough. So it sent a message that was very controversial. Mm-hmm. So as I write in the book, it's quite a period of time before Southern individuals embrace Thanksgiving. It's well toward the end of the 19th century at the earliest. And as I mentioned, I actually believe this very sincerely, that as Thanksgiving begins to be associated with football is the moment when more and more Americans outside of the North begin to embrace it.
All right, it only took 3 minutes for football to enter this conversation here today. How do we know what we know about the first Thanksgiving?
That's a great question. It's very interesting. There are a couple of sources that we draw from, particularly. One is a report from one of the younger Pilgrim members, a man named Edward Winslow, who writes a report in a letter in 1622. And then the longtime governor of the colony at Plymouth, William Bradford, writes a history late in his life. And both of them give us a little bit of foundation. But neither of them tell us very much. In fact, the most detailed description we have of that celebration in 1621 is from Edward Winslow's writings, and he devotes 4 sentences to the topic.
That's it.
I count them up. It's 115 words.
So we base our entire national holiday on those 4 sentences.
Pretty much. It's a very slender foundation.
Huh. So who was Edward Winslow?
So Edward Winslow was basically an assistant to the governor of Plymouth colony. He's in his early 20s when he migrates as part of that original migration in 1620. And actually, he doesn't live permanently in New England. He returns to England, and it's there that he lives out the rest of his life. He's also the only pilgrim that we have a picture of.
Really?
And we so often can see in our mind's eye those pilgrims gathered, and the reality is it's mostly imagination.
We have a portrait of him.
We have one portrait of him, although it's a portrait that was done maybe 30 years after the original migration.
Okay. The other name that comes to mind is William Bradford.
Yes, and Bradford was for more than 30 years the governor of the plantation and keeps copious records. So the reality is he's sort of the historian of this venture. His history, though, is very much kept private during his lifetime. Then it's passed down through descendants for a number of generations. Eventually, disappears, and we think may have been looted by perhaps a British officer during the American Revolution. Whatever happens, it turns up in the library of the Bishop of London in the 1850s.
How about that?
So it's a period of more than 2 centuries where it's essentially lost. And one of the reasons that the Thanksgiving story really only catches on in the middle of the 1800s is that most Americans had no inkling that it had ever occurred before then.
Again, that is so interesting. Well, when we say the Puritans or the Pilgrims, are those terms interchangeable?
They're not exactly interchangeable, although they are related. The Puritans, as many of you will know, were a group of English Protestants who believed that the Church of England had not really broken sufficiently from the Catholic Church in terms of its belief and its practices of worship. So the Pilgrims were a subset of Puritans who were wanting to purify the Anglican Church. But they were a very radical subset.
Very separatist?
The best label would be to refer to them as separatists, which meant essentially that not only did they believe that the Church of England was corrupt, but they actually believed that it was not a genuine church. They actually deliberated at length as to whether it was even sinful to listen to an Anglican minister, and ultimately they decided that it was.
Is that right? And I've heard you discuss the fact they didn't accept the King James Bible.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. They actually would have adopted or used much more a Bible that was first published in the 1560s in Geneva, Switzerland. And this particular Bible had study notes that were actually quite critical of the idea of divine right of kings. And so when King James commissions a new Bible in England, he's wanting to do away with those study notes and convince his subjects that he had sort of divine approval for his leadership.
So they viewed that particular Bible, as very pro-royalty.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
they wanted nothing to do with
them.
Right. That's right. That's right.
Would they being the Pilgrims, would they be surprised at how we celebrate Thanksgiving today? Not the modern day traditions, but just the fact that we have the holiday?
Oh, I'm sure that they would be. The Pilgrims themselves, their colony is never large. William Bradford, toward the end of his life, actually seems to be quite discouraged about how that colony has fared. I don't think he ever would, at the end of his life at least, anticipated that we would remember them in some sense as sort of honorary founders. And then in terms of just the celebration of Thanksgiving itself, I go into this in a lot of detail in the book that I've written on the topic. They didn't believe in regular holidays. They thought that holidays that became regular were almost always empty rituals. They associated this with the Catholic practice.
Even Christmas.
They did not celebrate Christmas. They did not celebrate Easter. They would say, show me in Scripture where we're commanded to do either of those things. And they wanted nothing of it. They did believe that Scripture gave permission for irregular, what they would call providential, days of thanksgiving or fasting and humiliation. So they believed if you're going to have a Thanksgiving Day, it's not something that you write into the calendar and say it's going to be the fourth Thursday of every November. They say you have these celebrations in unique response to unique blessings of God.
We're going to talk later about the implications of all this for us as believers today, but just talk for a moment about the trials and travails of the Pilgrims. It was terrible, wasn't it?
It was awful. It starts with the voyage itself on the Mayflower, which we can't relate to today, but the size of the tween decks area that they travel on is about half the size of a modern-day basketball court. And for 65 days, there were 102 individuals, men, women, and children, with all the worldly blessings on such a confined space. Miraculously, there's only one fatality during that voyage. But then they arrive right at the end of November. It takes them a month to find a proper place to settle.
And not the place they intended.
And it's not the place they intended. It's several hundred miles north, actually, of where they had anticipated landing. And so they actually will finally choose Plymouth as their location just a few days before Christmas. And so in late December, they will begin trying to create a new home. They have no shelter. They're living on board the Mayflower. They're actually wading every December day through water over half a mile up to their armpits.
Imagine that. Wow.
And they die in huge numbers. And they're probably dying more than anything else because of the exposure to the elements. Mm-hmm. Not starvation. It's not necessarily some kind of epidemic. But whatever the cause, by mid-March, of the 102 original passengers of the Mayflower, 52 have died.
Just a few months later.
About 3 months later. There are 26 families represented on that voyage. 18 of them have lost some family member. There had been 18 married couples. 15 of them are no longer intact. It's just hard for us to fathom the extent of the loss.
There's much more we need to learn and apply to our own lives today from that first Thanksgiving. We'll continue in a moment.
I'm so grateful for the grace I received while listening to FEBC all day long. I cried listening to God's message multiple times.
The Far East Broadcasting Company receives millions of responses each year from grateful listeners. FEBC is dedicated to taking Christ to the world through radio and new media. To learn more, please visit febc.org. That's febc.org. The Far East Broadcasting Company, until all have heard. My guest is Tracy McKenzie. Tracy is professor and chair of the history department at Wheaton College. He has written a book. It's a great book called The First Thanksgiving, what the real story tells us about loving God and learning from history. And I want to get to some of those lessons in a few moments, Tracy, but we're exploring that first Thanksgiving. There's a famous painting of the holiday, and I've been in a situation where you've displayed the painting and pointed out the various aspects of it. On the radio, can you hit just a couple of those highlights of what's in that?
Sure. The portrait that we probably remember most is one by an early 20th century New England artist named Branscombe, and she it sets the scene that we're also familiar with a long table set out in the open with the Pilgrims and Native Americans enjoying the feast. The thing to stress about that is that it is entirely a figment, really, of her imagination. There were no long tables. I think we can imagine the Pilgrims and Wampanoag seated on the ground. They almost certainly would have been eating with their hands. And when we think about those gathered, there would have been probably at least 2 Native Americans for every Pilgrim. We never see it that way, but they were badly outnumbered. They would have been disproportionately children, more than half of those still alive by the fall of 1621 are teenagers or younger, and there would have been 5 males for every female. So it wasn't the domestic scene that we tend to show. I liken it much more to a sort of 4th of July barbecue outdoors than anything else.
And it does illustrate how we've romanticized the whole Thanksgiving story, haven't we?
Oh, absolutely. When it really becomes a national holiday in the latter half of the 19th century, it's really presented by those who advocate it as a kind of domestic holiday. It would be a holiday for women. The men had George Washington's birthday and the 4th of July. Now women would have this domestic holiday that would center around the wonderful meal. The fact that there were only 3 adult Pilgrim women still alive at the time of the first Thanksgiving we tend to overlook.
And what was the Native American tribe?
It was called the Wampanoag. This was a tribe that was situated in parts of Rhode Island and Massachusetts. The Wampanoag had been absolutely devastated by disease. We don't know all of the details, but it appears that there were waves of epidemics that struck the indigenous populations of the New England coastline.
Brought from Europe, likely, right?
Almost certainly, probably by fishing parties that were touching on land over a period of several decades. So sometime from the very late 1500s to the 16 teens, New England's population was absolutely devastated. So the Wampanoag went from a pretty powerful, numerically large tribe to a really struggling, small remnant. And the reality is it's a blessing for the Pilgrims because the Wampanoag find themselves in need of a strong ally in the various conflicts that they're involved in. And they think that the Pilgrims might be a kind of ally.
So it wasn't a totally selfish act for them to show the Pilgrims how to farm and do everything to live life successfully.
No, I wouldn't say that. We certainly romanticize this as a kind of multicultural celebration. I suspect that the relationship always was quite tense. Both sides are suspicious of the other, and both sides are concerned about whether the other can be trusted.
Yeah. And who is Squanto?
Squanto actually is not a Wampanoag. He was a member of a different tribe in the general area called the Patuxent. And he actually, the story is involved and fascinating, but he actually had been kidnapped by European sailors a few years before over a really circuitous path that ultimately made it back to New England to find that his tribe had been literally wiped out by disease. So as a sole surviving member of this small tribe, he is effectively a prisoner of the Wampanoag.
Okay.
And they don't trust him either. And Squanto actually probably reaches out to the Pilgrims in part because he too is looking for an ally. So it's actually a pattern, intricate pattern of suspicious alliances and so forth. It's not the multicultural, warm and fuzzy thing that we remember.
Well, I would love to go deeper on all of these details, as you do in your book, but I'll have to refer our listeners to your book, The First Thanksgiving. And, of course, we'll have information about it on our program website, and that will be given at the end of the program here today, Tracy. Let's make the turn then to, and I know this is a great passion of yours, what are the lessons for us? We're not just out studying the details of history. We have to learn from it, don't we?
Sure. I think there are all kinds of lessons. I think there are many things that are admirable about the Pilgrims. And the reality is, the unfortunate thing is that we've turned them into sort of cardboard cutout characters, not really flesh and blood human beings. They were fallen people just like you and I, but they showed a great deal of courage in a variety of ways. Let me just suggest a couple of things. One, when I encounter the Pilgrims and take their story seriously, I am so convicted by the individualism that defines modern American culture, including modern American church culture, it seems to me. When the Pilgrims decide to leave Holland, they actually had migrated to Holland first from England. When they decided to leave Holland for some new home, they are determined to leave as a group. And they're determined to leave as a group. There are a variety of reasons that they're not flourishing in Holland, but they are determined to keep their covenant church community intact. And so when some are suffering, the determination is not to tell them to go and be warm and be filled and find some solution elsewhere. The conversation is, no, what can we do as a congregation to establish the sort of environment for our flourishing?
As illustrated, when they arrived, they lived basically in a commune, didn't they?
Well, they do. They build their homes within yards of one another. It's actually illegal. I find this so compelling. In the first laws of the Plymouth Colony that are passed in 1627, it is illegal for an individual male to live by himself. They thought that individuals living out of a network of accountability was not good for anyone, and they weren't going to allow it.
All right. Do you want to draw the lessons out, or shall I on that?
Well, I mean, you can think about it, but we are so individualistic, and when we encounter another people that sees the world in such a different way, it sort of reveals that to us in a new way. Mm-hmm. We see it again.
What are some of the other lessons?
Well, that would be one of them. The other thing that I really appreciate about the Pilgrims, again, it sort of was alluded to in something I said earlier. When they think about Thanksgiving, they're thinking about ways in which God intervenes in very particular ways at unexpected times in the routine of life. And so I think they understood the great potential for that sort of mindset to make us sensitive and ever anticipating and eager to see God's active hand in our lives in a way that I don't think a single annual holiday really does.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I've often said if I had done this research when my children were small, I would have loved to say, I'm going to imitate William Bradford, and I'm just going to declare days of Thanksgiving in our household. Without any prior warning,
by
something.
Dictate, huh?
Well, if there is a major blessing, if we have something to give thanks for, we're not going to wait till November. We're going to celebrate.
Which, when it comes down to it, that's the biblical thought of Thanksgiving.
I
right?
think so. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we can learn these lessons from the early days of Thanksgiving.
I believe we can.
All right. And we've got time. Share some more.
Well, let's see. I think the Pilgrims, in a variety of ways, had different understandings of liberty. That's something that has impressed me so much. You'll hear so many times that the Pilgrims came to America because they believed that it was important that individuals be able to worship according to the dictates of their own conscience. And they don't think of liberty quite in that way. Their pastor, John Robinson, said that it is a Christian's liberty to serve God and his neighbor. Our liberty is not to do anything we wish. Our liberty is the freedom to obey God's commands. And I think that's important to us today because when we make arguments for religious freedom, we always start with the individual. It is wrong to restrict religious freedom because as an individual, I have rights that cannot be violated. And I think the only argument for religious toleration from a Christian perspective has to start with God. And so Roger Williams, the great advocate of religious liberty in Rhode Island, would say that forced religion stinketh in God's nostrils. So that may be a way, a foundation upon which to assert religious freedom. But it's not the inviolability of the individual conscience. That's not, I think, a biblical concept.
Mm-hmm. When you, in this case, study the first Thanksgiving, in other cases you look at the Civil War, and you've written about other things as well, what are some of the personal applications that you get from that we can draw from?
Well, I think just generally, when we study history, if we do so faithfully and persistently, one of the things that should come from that is that we begin to see that we ourselves live in a historical moment. One of the things that, the Scripture teaches that we can lose sight of sometimes is just how fleeting our own lives are. So the Scripture talks about our life as a puff of smoke or a fleeting shadow and so forth. And I think when we study the past, we have that lesson reinforced. We see that we live in particular historical moments. We are shaped by the world around us, and we desperately need the perspective of those who have gone before us. I think the whole idea of the communion of saints that we refer to in the Apostles' Creed but almost never think about, this idea that we're actually part of a church community that transcends centuries, is part of a historical mindset that would just enrich our lives if we took it seriously.
And we hope that hearing this conversation today will help you take our upcoming Thanksgiving celebration seriously. We've been talking with Dr. Tracy McKenzie, professor and chair of the History Department at Wheaton College, about his research into the first Thanksgiving and the spiritual lessons it holds for us today. If you'd like more information about the book, please visit our website. In addition, you can re-listen to this interview online, firstpersoninterview.com. And as I mentioned earlier, a special word of thanks to the Far East Broadcasting Company for supporting First Person as we tell stories of God at work in the world. FEBC takes care to always broadcast in the local language, training local staff who can clearly communicate the gospel to their friends and neighbors. More at firstpersoninterview.com. Now, happy Thanksgiving to you, and thanks to my friend and producer Joe Carlson. I'm Wayne Shepherd. We'll see you next week for First Person.